In this video, I want to tell you something that really surprised me when I first found out. The main point is that most of the time when you're encoding audio, you're going to end up sending that out to a streaming service. So that includes iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, and most of these services are using the AAC encoding format. What I didn't know about the AAC format a few years ago is that the output of that format is always 32-bit. So this is really significant when we talk about how you output files from your digital audio workstation or whatever software you're using for recording. Here I've got a pair of files. This is a recording of my voice. I won't play it for you because it sounds it's recorded on this same microphone in this same room that I'm talking now. And here's the same audio file that I've saved at 16-bit. So this is 32-bit version, this is the 16-bit version. Just for fun, I'll open them. You can look at them in the iZotope RX spectrogram. Okay, so here's the 16-bit version and here's the 32-bit version. We're going to come back to that in just a moment. And here's the 32-bit version encoded as an M4A file in AAC format. Here's the 16-bit version of the same audio encoded in M4A format. The thing I want you to notice is what happens when we look at the file sizes here. So that's not what I wanted. So the 32-bit version after compression came out at 108 kilobytes, just for your information. The original input was 655 kilobytes. So let's group these together. So the 655 kilobyte 32-bit WAV file encoded down to 108 kilobytes in AAC format. The 16, let's not look at that size of the uncompressed file because that's not so important right now. The important thing is what happens after we compressed it. So when we take the 16-bit file and compress it, we got 109 kilobytes. So this is really weird. 32-bit input file and the output was 108 kilobytes. The 16-bit input file, which is smaller, we'll look at that now, actually had a bigger compressed output. Here you can see it. So the input file was 655 kilobytes in the 32-bit bit rate. At 16 bits per sample, it went down to 328 kilobytes, but these are the uncompressed versions. So obviously when you go from 32 bits per sample to 16 bits per sample, you cut the size by half, and you can see that very clearly here. I'm going to close these two. But now we have the same audio in the 32-bit and the 16-bit file, and yet when I compress it, the 32-bit version actually compresses down smaller than the 16-bit version. The higher quality audio is actually taking up less disk space. So let's talk about why this is happening, because it's really important to understand this so that you understand why, if you're going to streaming as your ultimate destination, you want to keep that input file at the highest bit rate you can up until the point when the AAC codec starts cutting the file size down. So let's get iZotope RX back up and let's find out why. Actually, those two files illustrated it just fine. Let's get these back up again. Here's the 32-bit one and here's the 16-bit one. So if you compare these two files, they look very similar. Don't see any big differences here, except as I flip back and forth, do you start to see where the difference is? This 32-bit file is clean and noiseless in this frequency range, but the 16-bit file has this constant background noise from about 15 kilohertz up to 22 kilohertz all the way through the file. What is that and where did it come from? That noise is dithering noise, and it was put there by iZotope RX. When I saved this 32-bit file, I exported it down to 16-bit WAV, and it gave me dithering options, and I chose the M-bit dithering. Personally, I don't like dithering. I'd rather just use higher bit rate, but if you have to dither, this is a good dithering. So we put that there on purpose. It wasn't an accident. added this noise to the file. In this video, we're not going to talk about why we do that, but for now, just trust us that this is something that everybody does. Whatever software you're using, whether it's Isotope RX or Pro Tools or Logic Pro, they're all going to do this to your file. They're going to add this dithering noise, and it's done to cover up quantization noise. So it sounds like a bad thing to do, but it can actually improve the sound a little bit. At least it looks that way on paper. So here's the problem. I have these two files, which are ostensibly the same thing, except for the 16-bit version has this noise, which you see here, and some noise you're not seeing, which is quantization noise. And all of that stuff has to get encoded. Just for fun, let's have a look at the spectrogram of these, the spectrum of these things. So when you look at the spectrum of these two files at this position, you do see some differences. If you look at the 16-bit version, you see there's a lot more noise in the high frequencies, and we could see that in the spectrogram originally. But you can see there are changes all over the spectrum, just from going from 32 bits down to 16 bits. And these changes are the result of quantization noise. There's really two sources of noise. One is the quantization noise, which is there whether you like it or not. And the second one is when we go down to a lower bit rate, we usually add dithering noise to kind of smooth things out, and that's extra noise. So if we come back to the question of why these files have a different file size, well, they're different because the content is different. And these AAC encoders, they vary the bit rate based on what the content is. So if you add more noise to the content, you might just get a larger file size. So that really shocked me the first time I saw it, because I thought surely the smaller file size going in would be smaller coming out, but it's not. And one more thing I want you to notice, if I take this 16-bit file, encode it for iTunes, and open it again, look at what it says here, 32-bit float. So the output of the iTunes encoded file is a 32-bit float, meaning that even though I went down to 16 bits at the input, I still got 32 bits at the output. So this is why there's no point in going down to a lower bit rate when you export files that you are intending ultimately to upload to YouTube, to Spotify, to iTunes. Because you're going to get 32-bit anyway, you might as well just start with 32-bit. You won't have to add the dithering noise, and you'll come out with a better encoding in the end. So if all you want to know is what you should do as a recording engineer, you can stop here. The video is over for you. For those of you who want to get more technical about this, in the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about what this dithering noise actually looks like, what the different types of dithering look like, what the quantization noise looks like, where it comes from, etc., etc. What I'm not going to do, and I'm sorry for this, is I'm not going to show you what it sounds like. And the reason I'm not going to show that is because this video will go out on YouTube, and when it gets encoded for YouTube, it won't be encoded at the iTunes Plus quality that I was using for the files you just saw. It will be encoded at a quality that cuts almost all of the high frequencies out, which means you wouldn't be able to hear, at least the M-bit dithering that I was getting from Isotope would have been totally cut out, which would make this a pointless demonstration. So we'll be looking and not listening today. The first thing I want to do is look at a 32-bit sine sweep in Isotope. So let's get this one up there. There's a 32-bit sine sweep. By 32-bit sweep, I mean the file is encoded at 32-bit audio, and it's a logarithmic sweep across the entire spectrum. So the main thing to notice is that this is completely clean in the graph. Above and below the line, it's just black. Now you see there's this halo around the line. That doesn't indicate that there's noise in the recording. That halo comes from an artifact of the viewer, the spectrogram that I'm looking at. It's not actually in the audio. So the next thing I want to show is what does it look like when we look at the 16-bit version of this without dithering. So here's 16-bit version. Looking at the spectrogram, I don't see any difference, but when we look at the spectrum, we will see a difference. So let's get the spectrum up here. I'm going to put a cursor down right here. And I'm going to try to hit the same spot in both files. I got it. And let's compare these two. So here's 16-bit, here's 32-bit. Immediately you can see the quantization noise. This input signal is at about negative, it says -6, but I think I generated the audio at -3 dB. And then we've got the noise coming up at about -125 dB. So it's about 120 dB of signal to noise ratio, which isn't bad, but not nearly as good as what we get out of the 32-bit file, where you can see the noise is, for all intents and purposes, gone. Perhaps if I expanded this graph I might see something, but on this graph the noise really doesn't show up in the 32-bit file, only in the 16-bit file. So we'll talk in a few minutes about where this noise comes from and why you get noise when you go down to 16 bits. But for now, just know that this is unavoidable. As soon as you encode at any bit rate, there will be some quantization noise. But the 16-bit files have a lot more quantization noise than 32-bit files do. Let's have a look at what happens with the dithering then. So the dithering is something we do because, especially at lower bit rates, when you play the audio quietly, this quantization noise can cause, it always causes unwanted distortion, but by dithering we may be able to smooth that out to some extent. So let's look at what this dithering looks like. White noise dither 1 in. So once again, these don't look different on the spectrogram, but you will very likely hear a difference between these two files, not on YouTube, but if you turn the volume way up, listen on good headphones, and especially you're going to hear the dithering when there's silence in the music. When there's music playing, you probably won't hear it. Let's see that spectrum again. Without dithering, we've got quantization noise, and when we dither, we add more noise, which seems kind of counterintuitive. How come adding more noise is going to make it sound better? But if we look at the mathematics, there's some logic to it. This is basically unavoidable. You could turn off dithering, but I don't recommend that you do it. And it's on by default in every audio editor and every digital audio workstation software. If they're done coded properly, they should be dithering when they export as 16 bits. And one more example is I want to show the M-bit dither from Isotope, which is available because I'm editing in Isotope. If you wanted to use the M-bit dither and your digital audio workstation doesn't have it, you could always export without dithering and then open in Isotope and then save it with the M-bit dithering option. So here's the, once again, here's no dithering. Here's the dithering noise. You can see it's adding noise all across the frequency spectrum. And here's the M-bit dither. You can see the quantization noise with the M-bit dither has dropped back down to it looks like it's actually below the baseline level. And then we have this much increased noise from 15, 16 kilohertz up to 22 kilohertz. This is the special characteristic of the M-bit dither, is they realize that if you're going to have to add noise to smooth things out, why don't you add the noise in a range of frequencies where people don't hear things very clearly? And it turns out that people don't hear very well from 16 kilohertz up to 22 kilohertz. It's not very audible. So what M-bit is doing is they high-pass filter their dithering noise and put all the noise up in that very high frequency range, which means that you're less likely to hear the dithering. But you're more likely to see it on a spectrogram. You can see the M-bit dithering very easily, clearly it shows up here, whereas the ordinary dithering, which may actually be more audible, is less visible. The next thing I want to show you is the 24-bit versions. So here's our 32-bit sound, very clean, don't see any noise in that. And when we look at the 24-bit, it's also very clean, and I don't really see any noise in here. And when we go to the M-bit dithered one, you can see these high frequencies have a tiny, tiny amount of noise. And this is really tiny. If this is 130 dB, this must be 140. It's down at -150 dB at a time when the signal, it's about almost 150 decibels signal to noise ratio with the dithering noise and the quantization noise. So 24-bit audio is significantly cleaner than 16. Let's put the 16 back up just for comparison. So here's the 16 with all of its quantization noise, and the 24-bit is almost imperceptibly different from the 32-bit, which means that if you're exporting files, if you don't have a 32-bit wave format, the 24-bit will be fine. You're getting 150 dB of signal-to-noise ratio, which is, I think, more than enough for anything you could do. The next thing I want to talk about is getting perhaps even more technical. From a mathematical perspective, what is it actually doing when we change the bit rate? So what I have here is a sine wave with just one oscillation on the screen, and I have a sample rate which is it's enough so I get 10,000 audio samples between here and here. And you're not seeing individual samples, but trust me that there are 10,000 little points along this graph between the beginning and the end. And I'm looking at it at 16 bits. If I go up to 32 bits, I don't think you can see any difference on this graph, so I won't go up to 32 bits. But I can go down to 1 bit. It looks like this. So what this means is that with 1 bit, I just have a 0 or a 1 to encode my audio. I'm only getting 2 values, and the 2 values I'm going to get are 0 and -1. When the encoded audio for a sample is 0, then you'd get out a value of -1 volts, and when it's 1, you'd get 0 volts. And those are the only 2 possibilities you have. So this 1-bit encoding doesn't encode the sine wave very accurately. If we go up to a 2-bit encoding, we now have 4 possibilities. So we have 0 volts, plus 0.5 volts, minus 0.5 volts, and -1. And we don't have the +1 because we've only got 4 possibilities, so they can't, if we include the 0, you can't have evenly, you can't have an even number of different values above and below 0, because you've only got 4 numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it has to be lopsided, and it's lopsided on the negative side. So that's 2 bits, and if we go up to 3 bits, we'll now get 8 different voltages. So we've got 3/4 of a volt, half of a volt, 1/4 of a volt, 0 volts, -1/4, -1/2, -3/4, and -1. Those are our 8 different voltage levels that we can get out of this 3-bit encoder. Now, something I want to point out is that this bit rate is controlling the number of different levels that this sine wave can take. It is not controlling the sample rate. So if you're looking vertically, you'll notice that it looks like when I go to a lower bit rate that it changes less often. And it does change less often, but remember my sample rate is high enough so I have actually 10,000 points between here and here. The reason it seems to be changing more slowly, like this is holding on for a long time before it jumps down, is not because the sample rate is low, but because there's nowhere to change to. I have that smooth sine wave, that's my original input, and when I bit crush it down to two bits, that smooth wave doesn't have anywhere to smoothly go to, so it has to hold here, and there are probably 1,000 audio samples in this range, but they aren't manifesting as different volume levels because I don't have any other volume levels to go to. I've only got 4 choices. So just for kicks, let's go up to 8-bit, because many of us have spent time listening to audio recorded at 8 bits. A lot of the old video game consoles were 8-bit audio. And you can see at 8-bit it starts to look smooth, but it's a little bit jagged, and you can hear this as you know if you've listened to 8-bit audio. So let's talk about why 2 bits gives us 4 different volume levels. So if you have 2 bits, you have a number that's made up of 2 bits where each one could be 1 or 0. So you could have the number 0, 0, which is equivalent to the decimal number 0, or 0, 1, which is equal to 1, or 1, 0, which is equal to 2, or 1, 1, which is equal to 3. Now you can see on this graph I don't have numbers outside of +1 and -1, and that's because we're taking these values and just scaling them so that they fit in a range that makes sense for audio. Normally we like to process audio between -1 and 1, and we like everything to stay nicely behaved in there. So you can just scale these 4 values, end up mapping to the 4 numbers we talked about before. So if you have 3 bits, then you get 0, 0, 0, which is equivalent to 0, and 0, 0, 1 is equivalent to 1, 0, 1, 0 is 2, this is 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So from 0 to 7 you have 8 possibilities, and that's what you get from 3 bits, these 8 volume levels. When we record at 16 bits, that gives us a lot of volume levels. Let's look actually how many we get. So at 1 bit we get 2 volume levels. We have either a 0 or a 1, and we can scale those so they get us somewhere in the good voltage range for audio. At 2 bits we get 4 different levels. At 3 bits you got 8 levels. At 4 you have 16. At 5 you have 32. At 6 you have 64. And you can see the pattern, I think. So this is 64 is 2 to the 6th power. 4 is 2 to the 2nd power. If you have 16 bits of audio, 16 bits in your audio samples, it means each sample can take 65,536 different voltage levels, which sounds like a huge number, and it is a huge number, but in some cases it's not enough, and I'll show you how it could not be enough. You won't see it on this graph, but let's go back down to the 4-bit case. So as long as I have the sine wave at full volume, this seems to be a reasonably good description of the sine wave. You would hear a lot of high frequency noise from this, but at least it looks like a sine wave. But if I cut it down to 1/4 of its volume, look at what happens now. All of those other voltage levels that are available to us are now not being used because we're recording at a low volume. And even though 4 bits gives us 16 voltage levels, we're not actually using 16. We're getting only 1, 2, 3, 4 different voltage levels. All the others, they're still there. All these voltage levels, they're down here and up here. They're available, but we're not going to make use of them if the input signal that we're recording is too quiet. And if we exaggerate this more, if we go to 1/8 of the original volume, now it's as if I'm recording with only 1 bit. Even though I have actually 4 bits of audio, but I'm not getting the full resolution of the bit depth just because my volume isn't filling the complete possibility for the volume range here. So bit depth is intimately related to volume. If you have 16-bit audio, but then you come in recording at negative 20 dB, you're not using the full resolution that's available to you at 16 bits, and so it's almost like you're actually only getting like 11 or 12 bits of probably more like 12 bits of audio. So when we think about 16 bits and why 16 bits is enough to very smoothly represent the audio signal as long as the audio signal has full volume. And when the idea of recording at 16 bits, 44 kilohertz really became popular, it was when CDs were introduced at that audio format. And when we think about what CDs are used for, they're used almost exclusively for releasing audio that has been mixed and mastered, which means that it's gone through a compressor and the volume is by and large going to be near full volume all the time. Maybe if you're listening to, it depends what genre of music. If it's pop music, it's going to be compressed heavily so that you're always using the full volume. Other genres, classical for example, will have some quiet periods during the quiet and loud, more dynamics in the music. But this is really important to know that when you record quietly, you're not getting the same quality out of that bit rate. And 16 bits is enough to record loud music, but it's not enough to record quiet music. What about when we go to 24 bits then? Well, let's look at what happens when we go to 17 bits first. That's just 1 more bit than 16. But with 16 bits, we're getting this resolution of 65,000 levels. If you add just 1 more bit, you double the number of voltage levels, you're doubling the resolution. So This is maybe a little counterintuitive at first, because you would think, well, adding 1 bit to 16 bits, that's less than 10% increase. So how come that's doubling the resolution? Well, that's how it works because of the formula that we're using here. And also, I think you can see it in this example. With only 2 bits, you only have these 4 possibilities. You add 1 more bit, you get twice as many. So when you go up to 24 bits, it's not 50% more resolution, like you might think. 16 up to 24, it's only 50% increase. It's 256 times more resolution than 16 bits. And that's why we were seeing, when we looked in isotope, we were seeing this huge difference in the amount of noise that we're able to see at that bit rate. So 24 bits is not a small improvement over 16 bits. It's a huge difference. And if we go to 32, again, theoretically, that's a huge difference, but there are different 32-bit formats. There's a floating point one, and there's an integer one. If you use the integer one, you would literally be getting another 256-fold improvement over the 24-bit one, but I doubt that you'd be able to hear the difference. So I think we'll end there. That is a demonstration just to show what bit depth is, what it means, how much different 24 bits is compared to 16 bits. And the one thing that I want you to remember, if you remember nothing else, is that if you're going into any kind of streaming services, use 32-bit audio if you can, because even if you use something less, you won't get any benefit from it. And you might actually, you probably will be getting more noise and more bigger file sizes than you would if you had just used the 32-bit input source. If you enjoyed watching this video and you like this kind of information, consider hitting the subscribe button down below the video. That way, next time you watch YouTube videos, videos from this channel are more likely to come up in your video feed.